If there's one thing the world agrees on, it's that no one made lunch quite like Grandma. Not even close. So grab a cozy spot and settle in, because the next 2 hours are pure Grandma-style deliciousness that's bound to leave you hungry for every memory-filled meal. The meatball sub is the kind of sandwich that's meant to be messy. The meatball sub has its origins in Italian-American cuisine. While meatballs are a traditional Italian dish, the meatball sub became popular in the U.S. as Italian immigrants put an American twist to it. We're talking juicy meatballs, marinara sauce topped with melted cheese on a long, crusty roll. Yeah, it doesn't really get more American than this. What makes or breaks this sandwich is the sauce, and Grandma knew it all too well. The sauce had to be the right balance of sweetness and acidity, and of course, the bread had to be sturdy enough to hold everything together. It's the kind of sandwich that you need 2 hands to eat, and maybe a napkin or 2, but it's worth every bite. It's a classic comfort food that never goes out of style. Remember what chilly days at Gram's called for back in the day? If you guessed hot turkey sandwich, you're absolutely right. This sandwich was another one of Grandma's delicious ways of using up leftover turkey from Thanksgiving. This sandwich featured slices of tender turkey served hot, often open-faced, with a generous ladle of rich, savory gravy poured over the top. Sounds delicious, right? Grandma made her hot turkey sandwich special with the gravy. Whether she made it from scratch with turkey drippings or used a trusted recipe, the rich gravy soaked into the bread, making each bite juicy and flavorful. She knew that nothing went to waste, and the hot turkey sandwich was a delicious way to make the most of those leftovers. Liverwurst might not be everyone's cup of tea, but for those who loved it, there was nothing quite like a liverwurst sandwich. So, liverwurst, or liver sausage, has German roots and is a staple in many European countries. The name liverwurst comes from the German words Leber, which means liver, and Wurst, which means sausage. This one was also made with rye bread and was a common street food in the streets of New York. Grandma gave it a home-like feel by using homemade bread and using fresh veggies and toppings like mustard, pickles, or onions. Grandma knew that liverwurst sandwiches were a bit of a specialty, something that not everyone would appreciate. But for those who did, it was a real treat. Deli classics have always been Gram's specialty, and the corned beef sandwich was no exception. This one started out as a nod to the traditions of Eastern European cuisine and became popular in the United States in the early 20th century. In case you're wondering about the name, corned beef comes from the curing process. Corned refers to the large grains of salt that are used to preserve the meat. This was a pretty simple beef sandwich with a hint of mustard, but its taste really spoke for itself. And it even made its way into pop culture by being frequently featured in TV shows, movies, etc. For example, in the film The Godfather, there's a memorable scene where a character is shown eating a corned beef sandwich. If you've seen the movie, I'm sure you remember it. Speaking of adding butter to the mix and elevating the dish, cheese has a pretty similar effect when you mix it with some scrambled eggs. It was one of the dreamiest breakfasts you could wake up to. The scent of freshly scrambled eggs forming a clear road that guided you to the kitchen, with each step taken increasing that early morning appetite. Once you sit, you are blessed with the glorious glow of cheese mixed with shining yolk and brilliant egg whites, scrambled to complete perfection mixed in with Grandma's special seasonings. That usually just meant a dash of paprika and oregano here and there. What was truly special, though, is how Grandma would manage to melt the cheese into the egg without compromising on how scrambled it was, which is an art lost to them now. There really is nothing like a grilled cheese sandwich, a meal that you have seen in the media, in kitchens, all over neighborhoods, in stalls and diners, and just about everywhere else. Sometimes you are in too much of a rush to make anything proper, or you just might only have some cheese and bread on hand. Everyone still needs to eat, but does that mean we have to wash down something we do not even like the taste of? No! And the popularity of grilled cheese sandwiches is a testament to that. But how did these sandwiches get so popular? Well, most Americans can only remember them as a loving meal that their grandmother would make in times exactly like what we described. The best part is that regardless of what kind of bread or cheese you like, every combo works just as well, which is something we cannot say about many dishes. So here is a dish that you may not see coming or be prepared for, But it actually works really well this way too. We are talking about peanut butter jelly and banana toast, which is exactly what it sounds like. You take some toast, preferably toast until it's crunchy, then lather it with as much peanut butter and jelly as you desire, and layer it with sliced bananas. You may have only heard of that combo as a part of some protein shake or smoothie, but it works just as well sitting on top of bread as it does in a glass. This is also a perfectly refreshing option for when you are low on work, and grandmas obviously kept that in mind. When they could just tell that somebody in the household needed a sugar rush and a kick from behind to get them into high gear, they would feed them a lot more toast than was probably wise, but it would work every time. Duck à l'orange became one of those iconic dishes in the 70s. It was maybe the peak of fascination for French cuisine. It was known for its amazing taste palette. The rich, savory duck meat complemented by the sweet orange sauce was a staple for high-end dining, and you could find it only at the most exclusive restaurants. The preparation for duck à l'orange was complex and time-consuming, plus it required expert culinary skills in order for the dish to have perfectly balanced flavors. The duck itself was usually roasted, which allowed it to have crispy skin and tender and juicy meat. But anyone can make a roasted duck. The key to this delicacy is the sauce. It was made from fresh orange juice, zest, and the reduction of stock, vinegar, sugar, and sometimes even a splash of Grand Marnier to enhance the citrus notes. It was loved by all, and the reason for this stems from the fact that duck à l'orange was a combination of luxury and tradition. Ducks were always associated with French cuisine, and the preparation added a modern twist to an otherwise classic dish. This meal was seen as a sophisticated choice, appealing to those with refined palates. Duck à l'orange was sometimes served with thinly sliced oranges and fresh herbs, arranged with great thought in order to create a visually stunning plate. It wasn't all about the taste, but about the aesthetics as well. In some restaurants, the duck was carved tableside, enhancing the diner's experience. This ritual didn't only highlight the chef's skills, but it also made the diners more engaged in the meal preparation. This dish also played a role in social gatherings, as it was often the meal choice for dinner parties and special occasions. And how could it not? It looks like something straight out of a movie. And once again, everyone was expecting this one: caviar and blennies. It was the epitome of luxury dining in the 70s. Caviar and blennies represented the taste for finer things amongst the wealthy. Caviar, if you didn't know, is the salted roe of sturgeon and was highly prized for its delicate texture and rich flavor. The flavor and texture varied depending on the type of sturgeon and its origin. Beluga, ossetra, and sevruga were the most wanted varieties, and they were sourced from the Caspian and Black Seas. I'll take a wild guess and say that most of you don't know the different types of caviar, and neither did I until researching this video, so let me explain. Beluga caviar has large soft eggs and offers a buttery flavor, while ossetra caviar provides a nutty and firm texture. Sevruga is the smallest, and it's known for its strong and salty flavor. Now, what the hell are blennies? Maybe I'm just too poor to know these kinds of foods, but allow my poor self to explain. Blennies are traditional Russian pancakes made from buckwheat or wheat flour. They were the perfect little caviar transporters. Their soft base complemented perfectly the richness of the caviar, which created the perfect harmony of tastes. The blennies always had to be fresh and warm to contrast nicely with the coldness of the caviar. You might think, well, they're just small pancakes. What more is there? Well, they had to be prepared really carefully, because overmixing them could result in them being tough, which would completely take away from the whole experience. Blennies were traditionally served with a dollop of crème fraîche, chopped onions, hard-boiled eggs, and sometimes a squeeze of lemon juice to enhance the caviar's natural flavor. But the pairing of caviar and blennies wasn't just for the taste, it was for the ritualistic experience. The same with escargot. And once again, I'll pose the same question. Why, oh why, would you want to know what fish eggs taste like? At least the caviar doesn't look as disgusting as escargot. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, You gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else. But Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical Southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? I know for a fact you've all grown up on some of your grandparents' baked ziti, especially if you have some Italian roots, and if you do, then you share that in common with this dish. Right from the streets of Italy, immigrants first brought this dish over in the middle of the 19th century throughout the early start of the 20th one, so it had a lot of time to become something that people could love and associate with the finer things in life. People had a lot of time by the mid-20th century to try this dish, and plenty of families had passed their own secret baked ziti recipes down. The baked ziti really hit its highest highs during that time period in the 1950s to the 1970s, and it was something you could enjoy at both a potluck and a fancy at-home date. It was a staple of Italian-American cooking, and you could even find it at weddings. I, for one, think that really speaks to how popular the dish was. But what's your experience with this dish? And if you don't have any yet, is it something you'd ever try out? Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Speaking of those times, another really good source of protein was catfish, and one of the best ways to have it, let's have a full circle moment with another sandwich that made sure leftovers didn't go to waste. Grandma's cold meatloaf sandwich was one of those dishes that tasted even better the next day. Meatloaf has been a staple in American kitchens since the Great Depression when home cooks, mostly grandmas, stretched ground meat with fillers like breadcrumbs and oats. The sandwich became a popular way to make the leftovers go even further. Now, there were no strict rules for what went in this sandwich, so Gram put whatever she could find. You could use a variety of bread types, sourdough, rye, or even a soft white loaf, and top it with anything from ketchup and mustard to mayo, pickles, or even lettuce. You could even eat it cold, so it was really comfort food at its finest. There were many versions of this sandwich throughout the United States. Some meatloaves were sweetened with ketchup or brown sugar glaze, while others included a mix of ground beef, pork, and even veal. Last but certainly not least, we have the bologna sandwich. This one's still popular and never really vanished from Grandma's lunch table. Bologna, or bologna, originally hails from Bologna, Italy, where a similar sausage called mortadella is made. Of course, America has its own simplified version. A classic bologna sandwich usually included slices of bologna, white bread, and a slather of mustard or mayonnaise. But some of our grandmas added cheese or pickles for some extra flavor. This sandwich became a lunchbox favorite in the mid-20th century, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s, since it was light on the pockets. In American slang, it's called the bologna sandwich, and the word means something nonsensical or silly, which refers to the inexpensive and playful nature of the sandwich. This one was so famous that country singer Jimmy Dean even wrote a song about it called Bologna. Our grandmas loved the song as much as they loved whipping this one up for us. Fisherman stew was something that got popular because of necessity. Back then, fishermen used to be out at sea for so long that they'd often go days or sometimes even weeks without seeing home or their families. It was the cons of the job, you know? What were you going to do? Sit at home and hang your net, giving it all up because you haven't had enough time to unwind? One thing that hasn't changed about America ever is that the grind never really stops, so that certainly wasn't an option. What was an option was making the best use of whatever the catch of the day was. Sometimes you'd get shellfish or crawfish. Sometimes you'd get proper sea bass or red mullets and monkfish. If you kept some basic vegetables and seasoning with you, like red pepper, onions, cayenne, and salt, then you could still make a pretty serviceable stew. This is kind of why the term fisherman stew is a bit of an umbrella phrase. Depending on where you are in the country or what kind of time period you're talking about, it can really mean 20 different things. Just mixing up the spices creates an entirely new dish, so imagine what it was like changing up the main star, the fish, almost every day. They were creating new stews on a daily basis without even knowing it. It caught on so much and became such an acquired taste for your average fisherman that they began having it at home too, and from there on, you can probably put two and two together. You have one really versatile dish that can work with like 15 kinds of fish, almost every seasoning in your cabinet, and every vegetable in your pantry. Stews themselves are really affordable and feed whole families while keeping everyone's health up, so it's no wonder that so many grandmas and grandpas used to serve this as lunch. You used to only find a Cocko van Blanc in French restaurants that really knew what they were doing. Top-of-the-line premium joints, the kind you'd maybe have to save up for. The black variation itself is a slow-cooked chicken stew, and this one is made with white wine instead of red wine. Some people that were familiar with the ins and outs of French cooking and had a good grasp of it would actually even make it at home. And I'm talking about before the slow cooker became everyone's best friend. They would really do the hours-long prep work just to get a taste of this, and it was worth it too. However, when the slow cooker did eventually come in, they let go of the ceramic pots, the cast-iron Dutch ovens, and the hours spent waiting for it to simmer and absorb the flavors. This meant that you no longer had to go out just to a restaurant for a Cocko van Blanc. You could just as easily prepare one overnight at home without even paying much attention to it. The braising process was easily imitated by any standard cooker. Naturally, that kind of accessibility means a huge rise in fans, and this dish had no shortage of them even outside of French-American households that focused a lot on eating traditional, rather than keeping up with the times and going for canned, processed food. Florida was known for its delicious sandwiches, and grandmas in the Sunshine State were masters at making the Cuban sandwich. It was brought to the States by Cuban immigrants and instantly became the talk of the town in Tampa and Miami. Traditionally, Cuban sandwiches were pressed in a sandwich press, or plancha, which gave them their distinctive crispy crust. Grandma knew the secret to a great Cuban sandwich was in the press. The sandwich had to be pressed just right, so that the bread was crispy and the cheese melted, but the inside was still warm and full of flavor. There's even a special day to celebrate this sandwich. National Cuban Sandwich Day is celebrated on August 23rd each year. Make sure to mark your calendars. The salami and cheese sandwich was another deli favorite. This is another Italian classic. Salami and cheese sandwiches have roots in Italian cuisine, where cured meats like salami were often paired with cheeses in traditional sandwiches. Salami paired well with various cheeses, including provolone, Swiss, or cheddar. So grandma just used whatever was on hand. But for a true salami and cheese sandwich, crusty Italian ciabatta is a must, and it's even better when it's homemade with love. Now salami has been around since ancient Rome, but it became popular in sandwiches during the 20th century as Italian-American communities spread their culinary traditions. This sandwich wasn't really the healthiest choice out there, but Graham loved spoiling us every now and then, and there was no better treat than this bad boy. Here's another French classic that's a bit different from the rest of the sandwiches on the list. The Monte Cristo sandwich is a variation of the French croque monsieur. In simpler terms, it's a classic grilled ham and cheese sandwich. To make a great Monte Cristo, the sandwich had to be fried just right, and unlike most, this was dipped in egg batter and fried. The name was inspired by Alexandre Dumas' novel The Count of Monte Cristo, and this gave it a luxurious touch. If you have French ancestors, you likely have fond memories of eating this at family brunches. New Orleans contributes to the sandwich table as well, and it's got a classic, the Muffaletta. This one originated in New Orleans, Louisiana, when Italian cuisine was on the rise. The sandwich is named after the round, Sicilian-style bread it's traditionally made with, known as Muffaletta bread. It's typically a large sandwich, so every time Grandma made one, it was a whole feast. Plus, let's not forget the olive salad it was paired with. Talk about Italian cuisine at its finest. If you ever want to try the OG Muffaletta, Central Grocery and Deli in New Orleans is credited for its creation. Yeah, it remains a must-visit spot for this iconic sandwich. So, here's the part where it gets controversial. Whether a hot dog qualifies as a sandwich is still debated. But for the sake of this video, let's consider it one. I mean, technically, it fits the definition of a sandwich, meat between bread, but many people see it as its own category. Hot dogs have been a staple of American cuisine since the late 19th century and became popular with ballparks, cookouts, and summer fairs. Now, the modern hot dog has its origins in German sausages like the Frankfurter or Wiener, but Graham gave it her own twist and made it according to our likings. The best part? If you don't like mustard, she skipped out on it. Yeah, the classic hot dog is topped with mustard, ketchup, and relish, but it could be customized. In Chicago, hot dogs were famously topped with a combination of mustard, onions, pickles, tomatoes, sport peppers, and celery salt, never ketchup. Moving on to Jiffy Cornbread. Now, of course, it wasn't only the Jiffy Cornbread mix that was used, but it was certainly the most popular. It quickly became the pantry favorite of the time. The cornbread was easy, quick, and versatile. Hence, it was served with almost any meal. You name it, chili, soup, stew. The cornbread was there. Here's a little cornbread recipe for you. Mix 3 to 4 eggs and add sparkling water and yogurt to the mix. Whisk them together until they are as homogeneous as can be. Then add the corn flour and mix until it's nice and thick. Now let your imagination run wild. You can add anything you want to the cornbread. Cheese, pickles, ham, paprika, anything you like really. The more ingredients you add, the better. My personal favorite is cheese and ham, sometimes with paprika. I don't really care for pickles. They aren't my cup of tea. Now, we're getting into disgusting territory. Most of the meals listed in this video were so far so good. Nothing too much out of the ordinary, and we still to this day eat some of the dishes mentioned earlier. But this dish is worse than the Spam. This is Scrapple. This dish originated from Pennsylvania Dutch, and it literally means everything but the oink. It was made from pork scraps. So, yes, basically it was made from pig scraps. All of them, except the oink. From the tail to the snout, everything. It was combined with flour and cornmeal and formed into a loaf, or a sort of pâté. Scrapple was a part of the ethnic cuisine of the Pennsylvania Dutch, including the Amish and Mennonites. For me, it's unimaginable to put something of that sort into my mouth, but for people of the time, it was sometimes inescapable. To me, this sounds like something Dwight Schrute would bring into the office. I don't know if this next dish is less or more disgusting than the last one, but let's give it a try. Fatback. Yummy. Just kidding, it sounds horrendous. And it is literally like the name describes it. It's fat from the pig's back. It was sometimes used to add more flavor to the dishes, but at least it wasn't eaten alone. I hope. It was mostly used to increase the tastefulness of otherwise tasteless dishes. Fat is still used to this day for the exact same reason, just packaged more nicely. I guess people in the 70s weren't so different from us now. But in today's day and age, when everything has to be lean and light, fatback doesn't have much use. But the upside is that we aren't stuffing our faces with greasy and fatty food. I guess some people in the 70s didn't quite have that luxury. Actually, thinking about it a bit more, people nowadays stuff their faces with greasy and fatty food. It just looks better than it did in the 70s. We've come to the end of low-income lunches, and wow, what a journey that was. Truly horrific for some parts, but a bit nostalgic for others. I think this video inspired me to make some cornbread and goulash later. Now that we have seen what the poor were eating, let's see what the rich had in mind. The 1970s were an interesting time, especially when it came to what the rich were eating. What did the wealthiest Americans indulge in the 70s? They certainly didn't just eat to fill their stomachs. They dined to show off their status and sophistication. The food choices of the 70s elite were all about indulgence. Their tables were filled with food that represented status symbols of the era. Let's start off with an appetizer. Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. We're going to take a bit of a deep dive into a cuisine that we haven't really explored before. I'm talking about caponata, which is a very traditional Sicilian dish that goes all the way back to the 18th century. It's supposed to be a sailor's dish. Can you believe that? It got that reputation attached to it because the birthplace of caponata was Sicily. There's no specific restaurant or name that's credited with making it, but if you ever went there, you'd know just how much the people appreciate this. The first time this became popular in America was when Mediterranean cuisine and Italian immigrants were mixing together and creating all sorts of new dishes, as well as bringing old familiar ones from their homeland. The best part about this dish for a lot of people was that it gave a chance to a vegetable, which otherwise people just aren't too fond of. I mean, eggplants aren't really the most main course worthy idea you could think of, right? Pair that up with some tomatoes, onions, olives, and capers and cook it in vinegar, sugar, and olive oil. Make a nice little traditional agrodolce sauce, and you'll get this extremely earthy dish with a lot of complex flavors going for it. So this is a bit of a tricky name to pronounce even when you give it a genuine try, but it's worth knowing about this dish because of how good it is. Ballymaloe Irish lamb stew is something that comes all the way from County Cork, and lamb stew is something that Americans welcome with very open arms. You can particularly find this dish being spread in droves around St. Patrick's Day in any Irish-American community. Whether you're in New Hampshire or Rhode Island, which even today have a pretty solid amount of Irishmen living in them, you're bound to run into a Ballymaloe stew once in a while. Despite how good of a stew it is, with tender carrots, potatoes, and tender strips of lamb, and how simple the preparation is since it relies mostly on the natural flavors present in the ingredients, this dish actually flopped once before. Well, I wouldn't say it was a true flop, but it did fade out of the memory of the general public before too. That was before the 20th century, but ever since then it has been seeing a bit of a revival thanks to social media and Ballymaloe House, which is what it's named after. Either way, this is one of the best recipes to ever come out of a family cookbook. And if you've ever had one while at an Irish friend's home, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Bacon. Rustic vegetable soup was the ultimate clean-out-the-fridge meal. It was simple and delicious, and as an added bonus, you didn't need a plan. Grab whatever vegetables you had lying around, carrots, potatoes, celery, basically anything that hasn't gone to mush. One of the great things about this soup is that it is no fuss from beginning to end. Our ancestors from the Great Depression era weren't aiming for fancy restaurant vibes, but rather just some homey, wholesome-feeling goodness. You didn't really have a specific recipe, but more of a suggestion on how the preparation went. You could add beans, pasta, or that half-used zucchini you've been side-eyeing in the pantry. The base was solid broth, maybe a couple of herbs and some salt. Even if you weren't the most talented chef, this wasn't a problem. All you needed to do to make this lunch was to chop up some veggies, toss them in a pot, and let them simmer. Voila! All of a sudden, you've made a meal that could feed a family for days. Your kitchen will smell like you've been working on that lunch for hours, but instead, it was the stove that has been doing all the heavy lifting. Rustic vegetable soup was cheap, healthy, and a great way to use up all odds and ends before they got bad. So next time your veggie drawer is looking tragic, remember, Rustic vegetable soup is here to save your grocery budget. Fried corn fritters were a Depression-era favorite because they made something out of almost nothing. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and very versatile, so in times when money was tight, corn fritters were everyone's go-to. All you needed was a little cornmeal, flour, water, or milk, and an egg if you could afford one. Mix it all up, fry it in some oil, and lunch is served. These fritters were the perfect way to turn pastry staples into something delicious. They were crispy on the outside, soft on the inside, and packed with flavor. And because cornmeal was so affordable, you could whip up a batch without thinking about how much money it cost. You could even throw in whatever you had in the house to stretch it even more and add nutritional value. Any leftover veggies or cheese added more flavor to the meal, making it even more comforting. Corn fritters were the kind of meal that made you feel resourceful and proved that even in hard times, you could take a handful of basic ingredients and make them into something delicious. Depression-era mac and cheese was a budget-friendly comfort food that made you feel like you were living large on a dime. While today's mac and cheese might be full of fancy and expensive cheeses, back in the day, it was all about making the most out of basic ingredients. A boxed pasta, some milk, and only if you were lucky, some cheese. But you better pull that smile off your face. It wasn't the gooey, cheesy kind that we know of today. It was more of a humble, lightly cheesy dish that could fill you up, don't get me wrong. The trick was stretching those precious bits of cheese as far as humanly possible. People would thin it out with milk or even water. And if money was really, really tight, they would use flour to make a roux, a mixture of flour and fat that was used to thicken sauces. It definitely wasn't gourmet, but it was cheap, and the most important of all, it was food. Even with such limited sources, this dish managed to be a crowd pleaser, especially with kids, who were just excited to be eating pasta. Depression-era mac and cheese was a smart way to turn a few simple ingredients into a meal that seemed indulgent, even if it was light years away from today's extravaganza. But you have to admit, sometimes you don't want that fully spiced-up mac and cheese. Sometimes you crave a simple canned version that won't make you regret eating it later. And that's exactly what Depression-era mac and cheese achieved. If there's one sandwich you can never go wrong with, it's the old-fashioned grilled cheese sandwich. This one is the epitome of comfort food, and Grandma's version was a childhood favorite. Even the pickiest eaters used to beg for this one. So this one became popular during the Great Depression era, when we had to make do with three of the most common ingredients in our pantries: bread, cheese, and butter. Now, some of us used to get creative with our grilled cheese by adding extras like sliced tomatoes, ham, bacon, or even pickles. But this one was best enjoyed simple and plain. Oh, and let's not forget, it tastes even better when paired with a warm bowl of tomato soup. Before burgers and fries, grilled cheese and tomato soup used to be the ultimate food combo of our dreams. The best part? Most cheese sandwiches are vegetarian and can easily be made vegan by adjusting the type of cheese and oil. So, this next sandwich is also typically made from only 3 ingredients, but it's still one of Grandma's most iconic creations. I'm talking about the infamous BLT sandwich. The name is an abbreviation for the ingredients: bacon, lettuce, and tomato. This sandwich was a summertime favorite, especially when tomatoes were at their ripest in Graham's garden. The BLT's roots can be traced back to tea sandwiches served in the late 19th century, but it wasn't until World War II when it gained popularity. During this time, supermarkets made bacon, lettuce, and tomatoes more widely available all year round, and Grandma made sure to use them up in the kitchen. A classic BLT is often made with mayonnaise, but some purists argue that the sandwich should be spread with butter instead. Well, it's still up for debate, so make sure to let us know your take on it in the comments. The key to a good sandwich was in its simple ingredients, and Graham knew it better than anyone. That's why she whipped up the classic chicken salad sandwich anytime we craved some comfort food. Chicken salad has been a beloved dish in American homes since the mid-1800s. Grandma decided to make it into a hearty sandwich to make snack time better. Grandma's version of the chicken salad sandwich often included unique ingredients passed down through generations. Depending on where your grandma hails from, her chicken salad sandwich recipe might have a regional flair. In the South, you might find it spiced with a bit of mustard or pickle juice, while in New England, cranberries might be tossed in for a touch of tartness. If you've ever walked the streets of downtown New York, I'm sure you're familiar with the infamous pastrami on rye. If your grandma's from the Big Apple, chances are her recipe is highly regarded. This sandwich became a staple in Jewish delis in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, thanks to Eastern European immigrants. This one just featured an old-fashioned slice of pastrami on rye bread and a dollop of mustard. Grandma knew that when it came to sandwiches, sometimes less is more, and pastrami on rye is the perfect example of that. But hey, don't forget no pastrami on rye is complete without a pickle on the side. The tartness of a dill pickle or the sweetness of a bread and butter pickle is the perfect contrast to the savory pastrami. Egg salad was another classic that people would often come home to when visiting their grandparents for Thanksgiving or just on the weekend in general. Egg salad typically consists of mayonnaise, mustard, and green onions, which add both color and crunch to the dish. When you think of a salad, your mind tends to immediately think boring and unimaginative, but egg salads can toss those opinions right out the window with just one bow. Especially if your grandma left her recipe laying around in some journal or cookbook she compiled all throughout her life. Egg salad in particular would go very well with rye, and it would work as a sandwich too. Grandmas loved bringing this one along for family picnics. Who could ever resist pancakes? Since we are visiting the all-time classics which last even today in almost every child's diet and life, it would be a crime to go without mentioning Grandma's beloved fluffy pancakes. Did you ever wonder what made hers so much fluffier? Pancake houses across the nation seemingly met their match when confronted with a 60-something-year-old grandmother who loves to spend time obsessing over her grandkids. So what is it that home chefs discovered that several brands and franchises could not? There are a few tricks they would use, like letting the egg whites relax in the batter before cooking them, or having impeccable flipping skills so just the right amount of heat gets to each side. Some would just whisk and beat their eggs and batter so well that you got one supremely thick stack of pancakes. It seems the secret was simply the years of pancake-making experience that are hard to replicate. Cinnamon sugar toast is a delightful breakfast combo that was a go-to for grandmas not just for their kids and grandkids, but for their own mornings as well. Sometimes all you need from the world is a good toast and a healthy hit of glucose, and cinnamon sugar does that like nothing else. Cinnamon in particular started getting a lot more popular as an ingredient during the times most of our grandmas were alive, since a lot of bakeries started using it with maple syrup and vanilla, though it was always a popular choice. It is just that little variations in daily meals did not start popping up until the 1910s or 1920s, and since then, cinnamon has become a mainstay highlight of all things that scream USA food. So our next dish comes with a bit of a history lesson that goes way further back than the time of our grandparents. Ham and cheese quesadillas may have been what they were binge-eating daily and serving up to us, but where did quesadillas ever come from? Apparently, they were not an American invention, and nobody could really find a solid name that they could credit with making the idea up first, until people did some history digging and found out that Spanish settlers that tried their hand at taking over Central America in the very early days of the land brought Mexican culture with them. The rest, as they say, is history, and the people of the USA took to quesadillas very well. Especially easy variants like the ham and cheese one, which meant that you almost always had a snack that hit the taste buds just right and made you full too. The best part about quesadillas is that they are so quick to prepare and easy to make that you can enter Flavor Town in just 10-15 minutes, which is a pretty good sell for anybody. Convenient food is always the best after all. There are times where you just absolutely do not feel like getting up and doing anything, and in those times, microwaving some mac and cheese can be really helpful. We are sure most of us have memories of spending the nights at our grandparents' and waking up to some mac and cheese in the microwave, or coming home from school to a bowl that you could lose your worries in. The cheesier it was, the happier a kid would be after eating it, and even at this adult stage of life, A hot bowl can bring all those memories flooding right back in. Mac and cheese started growing in popularity when Mississippi farm families adopted it as a regular meal, and from there onwards it spread to a lot of families everywhere across the states. We thank God for that little fact every day, since we do not know what we would do without it. Grandma Olpa's apple pie is a classic that only grandmothers are aware of or know how to make, despite it being pretty simple. It's something you could make on your own, but you likely wouldn't achieve the same level of finesse. Apple pies like this one are typically filled with plenty of apples, topped with a lattice crust, and smothered in thick, rich applesauce. It would often make for the best Thanksgiving pie you could have, and they would certainly keep making it every time the holiday season came knocking. The mixture of butter sugar on the top as well as the sauce makes it unforgettable if you try it for the first time, and it is addictive enough to keep making you come back for more. This is also a recipe that grandmothers were fond of passing on. People have been putting things on top of crackers for centuries now, and enjoying it as a simple biscuit elevates meat, cheese, and just about anything else to a new height. Tuna salad with crackers was just one of many popular additions to the trend, and it is a fan favorite across the nation. Preparing the tuna salad takes a little time, but assembling it on crackers takes less than 10 minutes. Grandmas had so many recipes like this that they could just be made in a flash but would fill you up or be a kind of snack you have never had before on your own. Tuna salad on crackers is something you can make too just as easily, so give it a try if you ever have just biscuits and some tuna laying around. Nobody is a stranger to wraps and how they dominate the bread world as one of the best things you could do with dough or pita or whatever wrap you have. Honey mustard chicken wraps are one kind in particular that have been really popular all over America, since a lot of families grew up eating these or bringing them to school. They were one of the most commonly demanded things to eat. Everywhere you would go, there was a craze for honey mustard wraps that was hard to beat out and impossible to escape. McDonald's had their own budget-friendly versions that did amazingly well with the people too, and home chefs soon found ways to even copy that. As a result, these chicken wraps have become a regular part of the average American diet plan. Also, they just work so well since they are pretty quick to eat too and can be made pretty fast as well. If you know what you are doing, 10 minutes is all you need to assemble and have a wrap ready to go. Imagine you're at a snack bar surrounded by croutons and peri-peri bites, but no garlic bread bites. You try something else in order to fill the craving, but nothing really seems to be doing the trick. Whatever is on deck is just not that tasty, and you seem to be recalling memories from days past. Your grandma would make more garlic bread bites than was probably healthy for children, but who could stop her from making everyone's day? The bites were so delicious and had the perfect amount of crunch, but also great potential for munching as you watched a movie or a show. That still holds up exactly the same today, so people often get to making them because they are so easy and take barely 10 minutes. Watch out, because this just might take popcorn out of your rotation if you have not experienced its magic before. Was fried catfish with hush puppies. This is again something that'll take us right to the heart of Southern cooking if we eat it. Along those rural places near rivers, lakes, ponds, and other bodies of water where you could find fresh catfish in abundance. Hush puppies were something made with fried cornmeal batter and were a popular dish to give to soldiers during the Civil War, so all in all, this dish was really light money-wise. Some basic Cajun spices or a Southern spice blend would make it even better into a real full-fledged meal that you could eat in comfort with the family. While it's been a big part of Southern cooking ever since the 19th century, it arguably had its biggest glory days in the 20th one as part of Southern soul food. There was a time in the 30s to 40s where soul food started to get into more and more menus across several places in the South, which wasn't always the case. Thank God it did though, because steamed catfish definitely doesn't hit the spot quite like fried ones do with some golden brown hush puppies. We're going to go forward in time a bit all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. At bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. Hoppin' John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, and yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin' John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives, but the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin' Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin' Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Brown Betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a Brown Betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the Brown Betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The Brown Betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like Apple Betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Buttered noodles are a dish so strongly associated with the elderly that they even have another name. Introducing Grandma's noodles, which were a staple of any family gathering back when simple dishes like this were still enough to leave a great impression on everyone at the table. The eggs made you feel great because they added a very warm feeling to the dish, as well as being great for you. The butter itself was just the right touch that the dish needed and brought out the chewy sensation of the noodles so much more, and the overall flavor was something a mix between creamy chicken noodles and chicken cooked in butter, shredded and diced with vegetables. It screamed love in every sense of the word because it was a dish that took effort and, more than anything else, a lot of attention to detail to nail. But if that's the job, then there's no one better for it than the grandmas of the country. Let's kick things off with a classic that's got a bit of a spicy kick: deviled ham spread. If you have memories of peeking into Grandma's pantry, I'm sure you remember spotting a can of deviled ham sitting quietly on the shelf at all times. This spicy spread has been around since the 1800s. The term deviled refers to the practice of adding spices to meat, and that's where this spread got its name from. Deviled ham is basically the spicier cousin of Spam. While Spam is known for its basic pork goodness, deviled ham takes it up a notch with a spicy kick and a whole lot of flavor. Back in the day, this spread was a go-to for quick and easy sandwiches. Graham would slather it on homemade bread or serve it up on crackers as a savory snack. Tomato soup with rice was a Depression-era lunch that combined simplicity with a great deal of comfort. You didn't need much in order to make it. Just a can of tomatoes, or even water and tomato paste, a handful of rice, and any seasoning you like. This was the perfect meal for a cold, rainy day when you needed something warm and filling that could stretch your ingredients and make them last a week. Rice was the main deal here. It could bulk up the soup, turning a thin tomato broth into a hearty meal. With rice, you can always assume that a little goes a long way, and it turned what could have been a sad bowl of red water into a meal that actually felt like food. Plus, rice was very cheap, so adding that to your meals meant you made sure that a small pot of soup could feed the whole family. And while it wasn't really gourmet, you could get your creative freak on and make it special. A few tricks included adding a pinch of sugar to cut the acidity and a pinch of garlic powder to make it zesty. Tomato soup with rice was the kind of meal that will get you through hard times without making you feel like you were missing out on some great delicacy. It was simple, satisfying, and budget-friendly. Savory bread pudding with leftover veggies was the ultimate Depression-era hack for turning scraps into a hearty meal. Got stale bread? Perfect. Leftover veggies that are past their prime? Even better. This dish was all about not wasting a thing. People couldn't afford to throw food away during the Great Depression, but instead, they got creative. And this meal was one of those everything but the kitchen sink meals that you might have heard your grandma or great-grandma talking about. To make it, you had to tear up the stale bread, mix it with eggs and milk and whatever leftover vegetables you had lying around. It could be basically anything. Carrots, peas, whatever didn't make the cut for last night's dinner. Season it with salt and pepper and maybe some herb seasoning and bake until it is golden and crispy on top, but soft and warm inside. The best part about savory bread pudding was that it made something delicious out of things you would usually throw away. And the Great Depression didn't look kindly upon those who didn't know how to save up. Stale bread was transformed from slices into a cozy meal that tasted like it took more effort than it actually did. This dish proved that even in hard times, you could make a meal out of practically nothing. For our next meal, we have canned tuna casserole. Tuna casserole became a classic back in the 1950s and remained a popular, budget-friendly meal through the 1970s. It was easy to make, and it could feed a lot of hungry mouths. It was tricky in those times, and imagination had to run wild to keep mouths fed and happy. This dish required 2 canned tunas, 1 can of cream mushroom soup, 2 cups of cooked egg noodles, half a cup of frozen peas, and the same shredded cheese. With all these ingredients, you must be thinking that the preparation is going to be something complicated. But no, just mix all of them in a baking dish, put it in the oven, and done. In 25 minutes, you'll be having a delicious lunch on the table. The good thing about casseroles is that there's no rule book you need to follow. Just add anything you like. That's what our ancestors did. Add anything that would increase the tastefulness of the dish. Now, I know this may not sound like a lunch dish, but hear me out. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. I know. That just sounds sad. And that's exactly what it is. Sad. Not all people could, at the time, afford canned tuna or ground beef. Some people had to eat what they had in the house because they didn't have the money to go out and buy new groceries. So if you had peanut butter and jelly in the house, that's what you'll be having for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Of course, it wasn't like this all of the time. But when times were hard, people had to make do with what they had. Nowadays, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are a great breakfast or school lunch material, but you wouldn't catch me eating them for lunch, let alone dinner. I definitely wouldn't have survived in a low-income household back in the 70s. Instant ramen became widely available in the United States in the 1970s and quickly became a staple for budget-friendly meals. It was cheap and easy to prepare. All you needed was 1 packet of instant ramen noodles and hot water. Boom! There you have it. A 2-minute cheap lunch. Just add the seasoning that comes in the packet and you're ready to go. Instant ramen is one of those dishes that is going to be present in every generation, in my opinion. It's cheap and delicious, and you can make different variations of it by adding more ingredients. Eggs, meat, seasoning, chives, etc. It's not the best dish when cold, but the good thing is you can make as many packs as you need without worrying about extra ingredients. All of the absolutely necessary ingredients are right there in the pack. Biscuits and gravy were a Southern comfort food that became popular in the United States for its heartiness and affordability. This recipe required a bit more cooking than the rest. So here it is. To make biscuits, you'll need to mix flour, baking powder, salt, shortening, and milk. Bake at 450 Fahrenheit for 12 minutes. As for the gravy, cook the sausage, stir in flour, and add milk. Then mix until it's thickened, and with just a bit more cooking, you have yourself a meal that will last at least a few days. Perfect for staying on a budget. Now this meal can be certified a good meal stretch. Just make more biscuits. They can last as long as you need them to. Every country has its own version of this dish, and it is highly adaptable. Crackers, sure, they're pretty good even as a typical easygoing breakfast, but what do we really do here? You eat something enough times, you tend to get used to it and get bored. How do you get around that? Well, since the topic is retro dishes, we used to hear a lot about bacon bow tie crackers back in the day. It was something you could find for breakfast or a cocktail appetizer, which is some serious versatility. The crackers were extra crispy since they were wrapped inside bacon and then baked until the bacon itself was pretty crispy. It was the perfect combo, and all they needed was each other to realize that. It was smoky but sweet. It was also savory, but buttery smooth and not dry at all. Dishes that are such neat little combinations like these are often hiding right under your nose, and if we didn't have the imagination of so many home chefs who found these and got them into the public sphere, then we'd be a lot more tasteless as a country. So the next two dishes we have on the list are actually some classics right out of Africa and its many varied cuisines. First off, we have chicken and collard greens pilau, which is just the perfect dish to have if you're aching for something that involves a lot of rice in it. The steamed and boiled chicken mixed with the pilau as a base for the dish gives it an aroma that's pretty much unbeatable. Back in the middle of the 20th century, if you really wanted to experiment with some foreign cooking and tastes, then you would go into African American communities and try out the best of their soul food. You'd have to look around a little for the really nice restaurants, especially if you were in places like the southern parts of America, but nonetheless, people found a way. Pilau itself is also a dish that's extremely common in the subcontinent for many reasons. People use basmati rice for this, which is a little different from the rice you guys might be used to, but if you give it a shot, you might find that it has a more full flavor all around. Also, don't even get me started on how good this is for you. If you're a gym bro looking for a great way to add some tasty protein and carbs to your diet, then chicken and collard greens with some pilau is a pretty flawless place to start. The next thing we have on the list is Hoppin' John's soup, which is right out of the classics of soul food in the southern parts of America and all over, really. I say the South because that's where people most commonly associate its origins with. However, the Hoppin' John dish itself was something that was a result of all the Africans that were brought over as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. This dish typically involves black-eyed peas and African rice, but in soup form, it works just as well with mushrooms, basic vegetables like bell peppers, and spices. This is one of the best soups you could find yourself making in the winter, especially if you live in areas where the temperature really drops to bone-chilling levels. It's so hearty and warm that the dish just screams pure comfort in every way and form. It was a really popular appetizer on a lot of restaurant menus, and it was amazing as a lunch too, but this is a textbook example of an old head recipe. You wouldn't remember it, and your parents probably don't either if they're a little on the young side, but I'm sure anyone's grandparents would remember having this, or at least hearing about it in the days when it was still one of the trendiest soups around. If you take a look at the history of Brooklyn, you'll find something that was really popular, which was ham cheese balls. These were the perfect bite-sized appetizer to gorge yourself on while you waited for the main meal. A lot of grandmas would have handwritten notes tacked onto family cookbooks about how to make the perfect ham ball, what the ratio of meat was, how much cheese you needed to put in, how much you needed to roll them and shape them before they were perfect. It was one of those snacks that just did well everywhere. In Iowa, too, it was one of the most easily available snacks you could find anywhere in the state. All in all, it's one of the best things to ever come out of the Midwest, and no Christmas is honestly complete until you down a platter of ham cheese balls and make the tray look spotless. Have you ever grown up around these? Do you still remember the taste? It's not something you would find so often nowadays, but the days when it was really everywhere were some good ones. I know we've had some wacky sandwiches and spread combinations in the history of the nation so far. A lot of those started off as slightly divisive, but they ended up making a place for themselves, growing out of the niches they carved into the food culture in America. Unfortunately, for fluffernutter sandwiches, it really did stay mostly as a niche, but a pretty good one. This takes your typical bread, nothing really special, and your typical peanut butter, again, nothing you haven't seen around the block 1,000 times, and adds a bit of a twist. You ever think about what peanut butter could be stacked on top of some thick marshmallow creme? Me neither, until I was searching about the history of this dish and how they were a Massachusetts classic. Speedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Speedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Speedafests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. You hear the name rumaki and you might start thinking about some pretty exotic dishes, but it's actually more of a humble appetizer that picks a few flavors and does them really, really well. It was also made at Trader Vic's, a Polynesian-style restaurant right here in Uncle Sam's USA, which I'm sure you didn't see coming either. I wouldn't blame you for thinking it's exotic, since at tiki parties it was definitely considered that, and when tiki culture as a whole started erupting into the mainstream of American eating, it was still sought after, with just as much interest. The dish itself also makes use of some things that aren't familiar, and some that are, like chicken livers, water chestnuts, and bacon. It was a really good hors d'oeuvre that boomed in popularity after the World War II era, though you'd be pretty stumped if you tried to go out and look for it today. Still, it's kind of sad we can't go out to parties and experience chestnuts and crispy bacon anymore, wouldn't you agree? Or is tiki cooking not really up your alley? Trying out your favorite ramen packet for the 1150th time this year for dinner? We get it, it is a pretty reliable option. Nothing hits that comfort food craving as well as ramen does. But did you know that back in the days of the early 1900s when it was not so popular, most home chefs would spice up ramen with some basic additions that are so common today that almost everybody uses it as a default now. We are talking about ramen with eggs, which is something that you may be so used to seeing in every TikTok and short reel on Insta these days, but it did not always used to be like that. Home chefs were the ones who started the trend of adding things to your ramen spicing it up and seeing what works and what does not. We have to thank them because they definitely hit gold with it. Maybe you've been watching and thinking that so far, nothing seems particularly healthy. Like maybe a snack for you looks more like a fruit and nut oatmeal bowl, rather than mac and cheese, bites, or grilled sandwiches. We cannot blame you. Sometimes you need food that keeps the bloat down and keeps you well fed while preferably not tasting bad. A lot of people think of healthy food and immediately think that it has to taste bad, or even if it does not, it will not taste as good as it could. Fruit and nut oatmeal bowls do not work like that because of how versatile they are. Sometimes your grandma would add almonds and diced apples covered in maple syrup, while other times she'd use crushed blueberries. The template lets you do different things with it every day, so this is an easy 10-minute option you can make whenever you need something to freshen you up. American ideas of a stir-fry often come from dishes like bok choy or aromatic heavy stir-fry that really have a lot of different flavors going on. The recipes that most home chefs and stay-at-home wives cook up is not that complicated. These stir-fries often include basic sauces like chili sauce, soy sauce, vegetable oil, and sweet chili sauce, along with standard vegetables such as lettuce, cabbage, onions, and whatever else you prefer. This gets you an easy dish that saves a lot of time and effort while still ticking the rest of your nutritional needs off for the day. It is also a great recipe to bring back from Grandma's arsenal if you feel like you need a strong source of greens in your diet and are not sure where to start. That is the beauty of a lot of these recipes. They may be decades old, but they were made and refined with the idea of lifelong use in mind. Plus, just like fruit bowls, you can mix and match different ideas that help you find your perfect veggie stir-fry. Try many kinds of recipes out since there is a lot to choose from. Not just one family was used to eating these. What's your favorite flag? If you have any appreciation for colorful ones, then you will like Caprese salads, which end up having all the colors of Italy's flag. This is an Italian dish that is really popular as a starter as well as a snack that has been passed down through families, after all. People love adding cheese to everything, which is something we are sure you are well aware of by this point living in America. Caprese salads involve sliced mozzarella, fresh basil, and tomatoes, and it is typically arranged beautifully. Well, that is if you get it at a fancy Italian joint, but if you were having this at your grandma's place, then it was a big bowl with a lot more cheese than they put in those kitchens. It really made the salad a lot better too, even if it was not as good for weight control anymore. Caprese salads are something you should try when you get sick of the regular French and Caesar salads. You might just find a new favorite. So, pita bread pizza, it is a bit of a controversy in some places and a beloved rendition in others. Let's talk about it. While the Greeks pioneered pita 500 years ago, the pie itself came to town in America in around the 1930s when the import of Arabic pita bread started becoming really popular. This would eventually lead to shawarma stands and the like popping up all over the place too, but people did not respond as well to pita bread as they did to other wraps. Some people thought that it was just a bad way of making a pizza, while others, like home chefs and grandmas, deeply appreciated how easy it was. They saw the use in it, and if you knew what you were doing, the pita bread pizza was pretty indistinguishable from a proper pie you would get from Jerry's. Let's wrap this list up with something that everyone has had once in their life at least. There's nothing like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich straight from the hands of your grandma. It was never the butter or the jelly. Those are just as good today as they were back in the 1900s and before everything started getting pumped with additives. Peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are some of the most iconic meals that this country has enjoyed, and probably very few foods out there have this much of a mainstream impact either. You could take the sandwich to work, or your wife makes them for you and your kids. The sandwich itself may send you down memory lane as you remember all the times your grandmother made for you. See how the act of making and eating a PB&J is a generational family experience? The classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe, such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. Before chicken became everyone's favorite pie stuffing, rabbit pie was a favorite on the Easter table. Made out of tender rabbit meal, this savory pie was a household favorite in many rural areas. Rabbit meat is not only rich in flavor, but it's full of nutrients, which made this a healthy choice for many and a staple of the American pioneers. Plus, rabbit meat didn't cost a fortune like most meat back in the day and was widely available. Along with rabbit meat, ingredients of the filling of a rabbit pie typically included onions, celery, and carrots. Some English variations included prunes, bacon, and cider, while the Australians sometimes included the food paste Vegemite. Rabbits aren't as common as they were back then, so rabbit pie has vanished from our tables and Easter traditions. You know what? All good things come to an end. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Yikes! Shrimp cocktails epitomized the sophistication of the 70s. It was served primarily in upscale restaurants and at lavish gatherings. It was truly a favorite amongst the elite due to its elegance and the presentation. The presentation was just as important as the taste itself. Large poached shrimp were arranged around the rim of the glass and set on crushed ice to maintain the fresh look. The cocktail sauce was a blend of ketchup, lemon juice, Worcester sauce, and sometimes a bit of hot sauce in the middle to spice things up. The hot sauce was a sort of invitation to dip the shrimp into the cocktail and enjoy the burst of flavors. The shrimp were lightly seasoned and boiled, then immediately chilled to stop the cooking process, which preserved their tender texture. This meticulous preparation was the key to having the perfect shrimp cocktail. The shrimp cocktail, oddly enough, represented the growing interest in health-conscious dining. It is interesting to see how the rich were living and drinking so lavishly, and the poor barely had enough for some so-called coffee. Moving on to foie gras. Foie gras translates to fat liver. It was a gourmet French delicacy made from the livers of ducks or geese, which were especially fattened. The origins of foie gras have been traced back to ancient Egypt, but it gained popularity through French culinary traditions. The birds are fed through a process called gavage, where they're given a diet to enlarge their liver and create a buttery, rich texture. This makes the special foie gras flavor and texture it's known for, soft and smooth. In the 70s, it gained a lot of popularity as global interest in haute cuisine grew. It was often served as a pâté or terrine alongside fig jam and balsamico sauce. The sweet and savory flavor added to the luxury of the meal itself. High-end restaurants would prepare it pan-seared or torchon style, where the foie gras is wrapped in a cloth and gently poached, creating a creamy melt-in-your-mouth experience. However, the production of this delicacy is very controversial. In countries like France, it is highly regulated, ensuring that the process meets certain quality standards. These regulations then contribute to the high price of foie gras, making it a true luxury meal. But the consumption of this delicacy sparked up ethical debates concerning animal welfare, which led to foie gras bans in places like California and New York. Lobster thermidor was a French-inspired dish that gained popularity among the wealthy in the 20th century. The dish involves cooking lobster meat in a rich, creamy sauce made from egg yolks, brandy or cognac, and mustard, often with additions like cream cheese and herbs to increase the flavor. The mixture is then put back into the lobster shell, topped with more cheese, and baked until golden and bubbling, creating a luxurious combination of flavors and textures. A little fact about this dish is that it dates back to 1900 in Paris, where it was created to celebrate the debut of the play Thermidor. By 1970, lobster thermidor became the symbol of fine dining. The presentation was equally important, as was the taste. It was a true centerpiece-worthy dish. Part of the appeal was the intense preparation and skill needed in order to prepare the lobster. Pair that with the expensive ingredients, and there you have the true delicacy. Lobster thermidor truly embodied French culinary artistry and American extravagance. I bet everyone knows this one: escargot. Escargot, a dish made from cooked land snails, was a symbol of sophistication and adventure in fine dining during the 1970s. Traditionally coming from French cuisine, the dish was embraced by upscale restaurants in America, becoming an indicator of both culinary expertise and the diner's willingness to explore unique flavors. The snails were typically prepared with a garlic and herb butter known as beurre d'escargot, which included parsley shallots and white wine. Once the snails were cooked in this aromatic mixture, they were placed back into their shells and served hot. They even had specialized escargot dishes that held each shell in place, ensuring an elegant presentation. They had really thought of everything, hadn't they? This buttery aromatic sauce paired perfectly with the slightly chewy texture of the snails, making the dish both savory and indulgent. Now let's be honest. The appeal of escargot isn't the taste. Why would you want to know how a snail tastes? No, the appeal is in the experience. And yes, imagine sitting in a restaurant in Paris and eating escargot. Or just looking at them from a safe distance. I would prefer that. This one has kind of a funny name: surf and turf. It was the epitome of luxury and indulgence in the 1970s, the duo of the finest land and seafood. It often includes a high-quality cut of meat, like filet mignon, ribeye, or tenderloin, alongside lobster tail, jumbo prawns, or scallops. Oh my, I really don't understand how people ate all that food and still stayed relatively thin. Maybe I'm just not cut out for this lavish cuisine. The origins of the dish are unclear. Some people think they stem from the rise of the American steakhouse scene, but others point in a different direction. And by different, I mean a completely different hemisphere, all the way down to Australia. The preparation varied from restaurant to restaurant. The steak could be pan-seared or grilled, and the lobster could be broiled, grilled, or butter-poached. But nothing would be delicious without the various sauces. From béarnaise and hollandaise to garlic butter, sauces were the ones making this dish extremely tasteful. This pair was really out there and conquering the culinary world. The mixture of savory beef flavors and the sweet, delicate taste of seafood elevated this culinary experience. Veal Oscar was a dish that originated from the Scandinavian culinary traditions. Named in honor of King Oscar II of Sweden, it is a multi-layered, refined entree that became a staple in high-end dining throughout the 1970s. The dish consists of tender veal cutlets, typically pounded thin and pan-seared to a golden brown, which forms the base layer. The veal is then topped with premium crab meat, either Dungeness or blue crab. I don't know about you, but all this seafood and snail talk has got me feeling sick. Yuck. Anyway, let's continue. Asparagus spears are laid on top not just for their flavor, but also for their vibrant green color, which provides a visual element of elegance to the dish. The final touch is a rich béarnaise sauce made from clarified butter emulsified with egg yolks and spiced up with herbs. This really is quite a delicacy. And I don't know about you, but I would much rather have some mac and cheese. But nonetheless, it was a pretty popular choice in steakhouses and continental restaurants. Veal Oscar contributed to the growth of American interest in global cuisines in the 70s. While we're talking about canned goods of the past, Tuna salad sandwich was another one of Graham's specialties. So, canned tuna became all the rage during World War I, and it was the most common item on the food aisle. Grandma decided to twist it up and make it into a delicious sandwich that shaped all our childhoods. This one was a staple at picnics or simple lunches at the grandparents' house. The star of this sandwich was mayonnaise. Yeah, there was no tuna sandwich without this key ingredient. It bonded the tuna salad together and gave it its unique taste. Tuna salad sandwiches were the top choice for lunch because they were easy to prepare and didn't require any cooking. Grandma could whip up a batch in minutes, and let's be honest, we ate them just as quickly. You can't have a conversation about classic grandma sandwiches without bringing up the egg salad sandwich. This sandwich started out as an economical way of using up extra eggs. Eggs were a budget-friendly protein source, and this sandwich with just a few ingredients from the pantry. This one also used mayo to bind the sandwich together, but some grandmas added a bit of mustard for a tangy kick. This was a post-Easter favorite, as after the holiday ended, there were plenty of hard-boiled eggs on hand, and of course Graham didn't let anything go to waste. You can make this one yourself with some store-bought egg salad, but it won't taste the same as it did back in the day. When it comes to sandwiches, only a few were as satisfying as the roast beef sandwich. So, many sandwiches were originally created as a clever way to repurpose leftovers, and this one was no exception. Roast beef sandwiches often started with leftovers from Sunday dinner. The Sunday roast was a time-honored tradition, and any extra beef was used to make delicious sandwiches for lunch the next day. In 1900, the dish was described by the Washington Post as unattractive and as a tired ark in a gravy flood. However, it gained popularity in the coming years when Grandma decided to take matters into her own hands, and by 1931, some critics even went as far as to describe it as a true taste of South Dakota. The bread for Grandma's roast beef sandwich was often homemade, and boy did she know how to dress it up. Whether it was a dollop of horseradish sauce, a spread of mustard, or a smear of mayonnaise, Graham knew exactly what it needed, and if we got lucky, she even snuck in a slice of cheese. Speaking of meaty sandwiches, the Turkey Club sandwich was another fan favorite. Now, this one was known for its 3 layers of bread, which made it stand out from the rest of the sandwiches on the table. The club sandwich has its roots in American culinary history, with some sources suggesting it was first served in private social clubs in the late 19th century. By the time Grandma was making them, it had already become the talk of the town. Graham often made this one the day after Thanksgiving when there was no shortage of leftover roast turkey in the refrigerator. The key ingredient in this sandwich was crispy bacon, which Graham added to make it kid-friendly and 10 times more delicious. Grandma's Turkey Club sandwich was often cut in quarters or halves, which made it easier to eat, and this was the first time sandwiches were cut diagonally. And remember the toothpicks Graham used to hold it together with colorful cellophane frills? Brings back memories, doesn't it? Spaghetti with garlic and olive oil was a Depression-era meal that proved you could make something delicious from only 3 ingredients: spaghetti, garlic, and olive oil. You could whip up a dish that felt fancy without emptying your wallet. This was the kind of meal that made you look like you knew what you were doing in the kitchen, even when you were just throwing stuff together. Boil the spaghetti, then toss it in a pan with sizzling garlic and olive oil, and in a matter of seconds, your home smelled like an Italian restaurant. Sure, you didn't have any meat or sauce, but who needs them when you have garlic to do all the heavy lifting? Olive oil gave the pasta a nice, silky coat, while the garlic brought the savory punch that made you forget how simple the dish actually was. If you had the means, you would sprinkle some Parmesan or red pepper flakes on top, but even without these extras, the pasta hit the spot. This dish was a Depression-era go-to because it was cheap, easy, and quick to make. And sometimes, less is more. Deviled eggs with pickles were a treat that turned humble ingredients into something delicious back in the day. Eggs were a cheap, reliable protein source, and if you had a jar of pickles, you were already halfway to creating something fancy, by 1930s standards anyway. Making deviled eggs is nothing revolutionary. Just hard-boil them, scoop out the yolk, and mix with a little mayo, mustard, and the thing that ties it all together: pickles. The pickles added a crunch that took the eggs from plain food to a party snack. However, the only party trick was surviving yet another day on a shoestring budget. People loved deviled eggs because they felt like a special treat, even when times were tough. The pickles added that little something extra, like a surprise flavor bomb in the middle of your egg. Plus, it was a great way to stretch a meal. Eggs were filling and they were perfect for families who had to make do with limited supplies. Whether served at lunch or as a snack, deviled eggs with pickles were a fun, zesty way to make an ordinary ingredient feel a little more special. Carrot and potato hash was a Depression-era staple that made the most out of two cheap and hearty veggies. Potatoes were filling while carrots added just enough sweetness to keep things interesting. This meal was perfect for stretching a limited budget because both ingredients were as cheap as they come, lasted forever, and could be found in almost every kitchen. The preparation was simple. Chop up the vegetables, toss them in a hot pan, and fry until golden and crispy. It was simple, but the combination of soft potatoes and slightly caramelized carrots created a comforting, flavorful dish. If you had an onion lying around, it could join the party, adding even more depth to this humble hash. The beauty of carrot and potato hash is in its versatility. You could eat it on its own or throw an egg on top for some protein. Either way, it was filling, warm, and super satisfying. Everything you needed to keep going during tough times. It wasn't the most exciting dish, but it got the job done. And isn't that what really counts? While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Can you imagine Thanksgiving without your grandma's famous turkey roast? Well, back in the day, roast goose was the traditional holiday dish. It was cooked using dry heat with hot air enveloping it evenly on all sides. Now, this is a dish I can get behind. Juicy, crispy skin, tender meat, and a flavorful stuffing. What's not to love? This dish was normally served with plum sauce to augment its flavor. It was particularly popular in England, where it was often served with applesauce and bread sauce instead. In Guangdong and Hong Kong, roast goose was a variety of siu mei, or roasted meat dishes, within Cantonese cuisine. It was made by roasting geese with seasoning, often in a charcoal furnace at high temperatures. This dinner isn't common anymore, but with a little effort, you can still find fresh goose and recreate this classic dish at home. Perhaps it's time to give the good old goose a chance to shine again. Sheep's head stew. Now, this is where things get a bit adventurous. This dish, once a staple in many cultures, involves cooking the entire head of a sheep, including the brain, eyes, and tongue. Yes, including. This one is a Scottish delicacy, also known as pausaudy, and was whipped up in Edinburgh, Scotland. Don't confuse it with the other pausaudy, which is a term for milk and meal boiled together. Dried peas and barley are other common ingredients used in this meaty dish. Sheep's head stew was often enjoyed in rural areas where nothing went to waste. Skinning the head and preparing it for the stew is a time-consuming task, and it can get messier, but if you manage to pull this one off, it is definitely worth getting your hands dirtier than usual. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took eat your skincare to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Love it or hate it. There's no denying that haggis is a unique and iconic dish. So, what does this dish consist of, you may ask? Well, this Scottish dish is made from sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, mixed with oats and spices, and cooked in a sheep's stomach. Yes, you heard that right. Robert Burns' poem, Address to a Haggis of 1786, made this meal Scotland's very own national dish and a literary classic. It is traditionally served with turnips and potatoes. Back in the day, haggis was popular everywhere around the globe, but it's limited to only Scotland now. While haggis might not be everyone's cup of tea, it's definitely a dish worth trying at least once. Salmon Wellington, also known as salmon en croûte, is a refined dish where salmon is wrapped in puffy pastry and baked until golden brown. Can you guess where it originated from? If you guessed France, you would be correct. It became highly popular in the 70s for its elegant presentation. The salmon was usually marinated in herbs like dill and lemon zest, sometimes even Dijon mustard for a little spice. Before being wrapped, the salmon is often topped with spinach, mushrooms, or cream cheese mixed with herbs, which gives this dish moisture and freshness. There's a variation of the dish in which the salmon is wrapped in crepes before the pastry in order to help with the moisture. And of course, we can't forget the serving since it was extremely, and I mean extremely important. Salmon was served with a light, creamy sauce such as white wine, dill, or beurre blanc sauce. These sauces complemented the delicate fish taste and elevated this dish to a luxurious level. Moving on to the king of salads, crab Louise. This is a classic American dish that originated from the West Coast, specifically in San Francisco. It became a favorite around the 1970s for its fresh and luxurious ingredients. It uses one of the most exotic breeds of crab that you can hope to catch in the ocean, the Dungeness crab. This type of crab is usually known for its sweet and tender texture, and it is typically served chilled on top of iceberg lettuce. Ooh, just imagine that big crunch. Usually, this dish is served with lettuce, hard-boiled eggs, and tomatoes. But the real magic is the Louise dressing, which is made from heavily whipped cream, finely diced green pepper, and sometimes horseradish. Speaking of authenticity, we are not even sure who to pay respects to for this dish. Most people just agree that it popped up in the 20th century on the West Coast and peaked in the 50s to 70s. The earliest reference we can find is Clarence Edwards' Bohemian San Francisco in 1914. Tornados Rossini is one of those dishes we would now call over the top. This meal is here to steal the show. It is named after an opera composer from Italy known as Gioino Rossini, and the dish itself is a melody of flavors. It is served in a reduced wine sauce with shallots. You may be thinking, well, what's it made from? It's not beef nor chicken, but it is pheasant. Yes, that's right. Pheasant. Now, we don't see much of that in today's day and age, but back in the 70s, this was quite a showstopper. Steak Diane was one of those highly popular dishes back in the 70s. Well, at least amongst the rich. This dish was characterized by a rich, buttery sauce made with a mixture of pan juices and cognac or brandy. The name Diane is believed to have originated from the Roman goddess of the hunt, symbolizing the dish's robust and hearty nature. What sets it apart from other steak-type dishes is the preparation that happened right before your very eyes. In an era when dining out was becoming a form of entertainment, the flamboyance of Steak Diane added a theatrical element to the meal. This technique involved igniting the alcohol in the sauce, creating a burst of flames that captivated diners. The visual appeal was as important as the taste, making Steak Diane a symbol of luxury and sophistication rich in flavors and aromas. It combined the savory taste of perfectly seared steak with the complexity of its sauce, creating a taste profile that was both bold and refined. Steak Diane's popularity was also due to its versatility in how it could be presented. Chefs experimented with various side dishes like mushrooms, garlic mashed potatoes, or steamed asparagus. The appeal of Steak Diane also comes from the fact that it bridges the gap between traditional and modern cooking. The sauce brings us back to the classic French cuisine, while the tableside preparation gives it a modern touch. The mixture of both worlds, Old World and New World, makes Steak Diane a favorite amongst people looking to impress with both culinary skills and taste. It had originally become popular in the middle of the 20th century, but it was given a new life due to its nostalgic value. For those of you who are brave enough to try and cook this at home, I am sure that your guests will be greatly surprised. It is not every day that you get a chance to eat a meal of this caliber. You can find the exact recipe in almost any cookbook, since it was very popular back in the day. Of course, the recipe is simplified for home cooking, but don't be fooled by that. You'll still be standing over that stove for hours. Steak Diane remains a nostalgic dish and a staple of fine dining in the 70s. Known as Liberty sandwiches and made by Emma Curtis in 1918, it was described as the perfect wholesome snack to get you a sugar rush whenever you needed it. Also, it was stupidly popular with children, especially around campfires. The stage for this dish goes all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, in 1970. The part of Ohio I'm specifically talking about is South Euclid, and the company I want to tell you about is Amster Pizza Bagel, Inc. They first submitted the idea for pizza bagels to the Copyright Office in 1970, which was the first official birth of the dish. However, the idea was pretty much cooking up a long while before it got the fine print out of the way. You can credit Anthony DeMauro for that, since the actual first time he made one was in 1957. 13 years of messing around with and perfecting the recipe led to a show stealer of a product for Amster Pizza Bagel Inc., which a lot of other fast food chains found hard to compete with. They even had a catchy mid-90s slogan, which you'll probably remember if you were a millennial from those times. Pizza in the morning, pizza in the evening, pizza at supper time, with an earworm of a jingle to go along with it. Something you can always associate with your grandma's cooking is waffles. There was no place in the world that could make a waffle better than your grandma, which is a belief that a lot of kids would fight you over. And I really do mean fight you over. For the kids, the peak of the experience was probably just getting those freshly baked waffles with maple sauce poured all over them. But for grandmas, the best part of the dish was how you could sneak in other things that the kids really needed and didn't eat enough of along with them. For example, one of the most popular combinations was catfish and waffles. Now, I don't really need to give you a rundown on America's relationship with catfish, especially around coastal and rural areas that are near lakes and rivers, or anywhere you'd find catfish swimming around. It's one of the most affordable and easy-to-make meals, and you can spin it 100 different ways. Baked catfish, fried catfish, steamed catfish, it just doesn't get old. You take it a bit further and match it up with waffles, which gives them that contrast that cooks are always looking to give to catfish with sauces and spices, but it doesn't really hit the spot like this does. It goes to show that you never really can teach grandmas anything, can you? So today we had shrimp and sushi, and before that we had prawn, and even before that we had catfish and cod. So what came even before that? You'd be surprised, but in the 17th and 18th centuries in America, eels were really common. Early Americans absolutely loved one rendition of eel, which was Old LP, and the fishermen used to keep a sharp and keen eye out for any eel available in lakes. Whether it was local streams or popular fishing spots like Cape Cod, everyone would always gather around a fish market whenever fresh eel was in stock, because everyone wanted to make a fresh batch of eel pies for the family. Despite how tastes change severely throughout the centuries, one thing stays the same. A grandmother always loves creating new food for her children and grandchildren, and a lot of home cooks worked hard to perfect the ultimate old eel recipe that they ended up passing down throughout their families. The taste of old eel pie itself is something that's really hard to describe. It has a texture that's almost similar to apple pie, but it has a really sweet and savory taste working together at the same time. It feels like these flavors are going in opposite directions when you think about them, but in that single pie, all of them manage to sync and create something really unique. Would you ever recreate this dish in your own home, or is it too old-fashioned of a protein for you? Bourbon and chicken wings go together like birds and the sky. or like strawberry jam and bread. They've been one of the most definable aspects of American cooking and eating ever since they were first made in New Orleans, Louisiana, which got popular for its bourbon chicken. It used to be a subset of Cajun-themed cooking, but slowly, over time, its roots got diluted and it became more of a nationwide thing that everyone got into. One of the most popular types of bourbon whiskey was cherry bourbon, and one of the best ideas people ever had was mixing that with chicken wings to get a cherry bourbon edition of the best side dish ever known to man. The taste is impeccable. The bourbon enhances every single thing about the chicken wings, while adding a new flavor from the cherry aspect. It kind of gives it this sweet aftertaste that's not really overbearing. You know, some of the best additions and flavors to a tried and tested classic are ones that don't overstay their welcome. They don't overwhelm what you already love about the dish, they just take it a step further with the addition of something new. That's why this dish got so popular at cookouts and pot roasts and was a given if your family was having a pizza night. African American families in particular would love a big combo of chicken wings doused in cherry bourbon, because no party really felt complete without them. You might think I'm over-exaggerating because what can whiskey really do? Well, once you bake these wings to crispy perfection and then add them in a cherry bourbon BBQ sauce, you'll know just how good they are for yourself. Give it a try because it's probably the easiest recipe on this list so far. We're back to the basics with this one as boiled mutton. Who doesn't love some boiled mutton? This dish exists in almost every part of the world, with every culture having its own unique variation. The mutton was often placed in a large pot with root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and potatoes, slow-cooked until the meat fell apart and the vegetables were tender. This dish was the perfect meal to warm your insides on a cold winter day. Boiled mutton emerged as a common meal in medieval Europe, especially for the lower classes where it was cooked only using meat and water. Now, this one is slowly becoming more and more outdated as people usually go for more flavorful meats. But with the rise of Chinese hot pots, instant boiled mutton might just make a comeback. Corned beef and cabbage. A classic St. Patrick's Day dish, but did you know it was once a common comfort food? Known as salt beef in some Commonwealth countries, this American-Irish dish was a hearty protein source and a staple on the table during the 17th through the early 20th centuries. It was tinned along with sugar and spices during World War I and World War II when fresh meat was rationed. Cabbage brought in the right amount of nutrients, making this meal not just delicious, but also a healthy choice. While still popular in some circles, corned beef and cabbage aren't half as famous as it once was. But if you're ever up for some good old-fashioned cooking, there are recipes for this one all over the internet and they're pretty easy to follow. And finally, we have stuffed lamb heart. This dish is another example of our ancestors' resourceful use of every part of an animal. This meaty meal also goes around with the unique nickname of love in disguise in many parts of England. While the origins are unclear, it first emerged in Kettner's Book of the Table in 1887 and took over Great Britain. The heart was cleaned, stuffed with breadcrumbs, herbs, and sometimes even minced meat, and then roasted or braised. This was a nutrient-rich meal which was a fulfilling delicacy after a long day of hard work. Though it's rarely seen today, lamb hearts are still common in many local dishes in South Asian countries. Do these classic meat meals stir up tasty memories? If so, like this video, click subscribe and stay tuned for more nostalgia trips. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, This one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. If you think the beef heart is off limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. Bear meat might seem like something out of a survivalist's handbook, but it was once a prized delicacy in many cultures. The roast loin of bear was considered a special occasion dish, reserved for feasts and celebrations. This dish has deep roots in the culinary traditions of the early American settlers. As you can imagine, hunting a bear was a daunting task, so this meal was a reward for bravery. Apart from the hunting of the bears, this one wasn't complicated to whip up. All you needed was the loin, which is the tender strip of meat along the backbone, which was often roasted over an open fire. Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Onion and potato frittata was an everyday favorite because they turned simple ingredients into a meal that felt special. Potatoes were cheap and filling, and onions added the extra flavor. The beauty of frittata was in its simplicity. You'd slice up some potatoes and onions, fry them until golden, and then pour beaten eggs over the top. Cook it until the eggs are set. And just like that, you had a hearty, savory dish that worked for any meal. It was one of those dishes that could stretch to feed a crowd. Plus, if you had a little cheese lying around, you were going to become a favorite lunch host. It was an easy way to make a meal feel complete without having to use any expensive ingredients. This frittata was super versatile as well. You could throw in whatever veggies or leftovers you had on hand. Whether eaten for breakfast, lunch, or dinner, onion and potato frittata was a reliable go-to that made the most out of limited supplies and left you feeling full and satisfied. It proved that a little creativity could vastly change the food game in the house. Moving on to something sweet for a second, rice pudding with raisins. It was a Depression-era answer to a comforting dessert made from almost nothing. Leftover rice, milk or water, some sugar, and a handful of raisins were all it took to make your kids happy with a sweet treat. The magic happened when the rice simmered down into a creamy, pudding-like consistency, turning something so plain into a dessert that felt a little indulgent. Raisins were the main show here. They added the perfect amount of taste and texture, making it taste fancy rather than ordinary. Just the thought of raisins makes me want to retch. I truly admire the strength our ancestors had when they were able to eat food like this. Don't get me wrong, I love rice pudding. But raisins? No way, not a chance. The best part about rice pudding is how flexible the recipe could be. If you were like me and didn't like raisins, you could just sprinkle some cinnamon on top, or maybe even a splash of vanilla if you were feeling fancy. For families looking to make a warm, sweet, and filling dessert, rice pudding with raisins was the perfect way to go. It satisfied almost every sweet tooth without costing much, making it a household favorite. Plus, it was really simple to make, so even the kids could help and stir the pot. Some of those kids are now our grandparents teaching us those same recipes. How beautiful is that? Mac and cheese, the iconic dish that stood the test of time. I know some of you may be thinking that mac and cheese isn't very budget-friendly, and I agree to some point. Some versions included macaroni in the can, while others only contained the sauce. But if you're making the pre-made version, it can be a really good meal stretch. People used to make the canned version of mac and cheese, which was, of course, cheaper. Some of those versions included the macaroni inside the can, and some contained just the sauce. But either way, you could have a decent meal for just a few dollars. The second most popular meal was meatloaf. Pretty plain and simple. Minced meat was and still is really cheap, but in exchange, it isn't the healthiest option. But that wasn't the biggest concern of our ancestors back in the 70s. People were struggling to put any food on the table, let alone a healthy one. The meatloaf was easy to prepare, and it served as a way of using any leftover food you had in the house. Just throw it all together. It'll be delicious in the end. For the preparation, people used to throw together the ground beef and mix it with an egg and some milk, although milk was optional. Then throw in some breadcrumbs or leftover oats and bake. Bonus points if you had any leftover veggies. By adding the fillers, people found a way to elevate the meal and increase its nutritional value. It isn't the fanciest food option, but you can't say it wasn't delicious. A fun fact about meatloafs is that they became popular during the Great Depression and during the 1970s. You might be familiar with this one: Spam and eggs. Spam was a popular meat product at the time of World War II. It was a meat that didn't require refrigeration. Horrific. Absolutely horrific. But even years after World War II, Spam was still one of the go-to inexpensive food items. The recipe for this meal calls for 1 can of sliced Spam, ooh, that rhymes, eggs and seasoning. The Spam was being fried, which sounds absolutely disgusting, and then eggs were scrambled in the same pan. That may sound awful, but it was what people had to resort to. The times weren't so lucky back then, at least not for some people. The famous goulash. The ingredients are fairly simple, and they consist of ground beef, onions, macaroni, tomato sauce, and diced tomatoes. Cook the onions in a pan until they are a nice golden brown color. Then add the ground beef, tomato sauce, and diced tomatoes. Stir them all together until they're properly cooked. At the end, throw it together with cooked macaroni and let it simmer for a while. It does take a bit more time, but I promise that it is worth it. The goulash is still to this day one of the favorite dishes to be served at a family lunch. A little goulash backstory. Goulash is a Hungarian dish that found its way to the hearts of all Americans in the 1970s, and it was adapted to be a one-pot dish and a budget-friendly meal for entire families. Again, really good if you're looking for a meal stretch option. And nothing, and I mean nothing, is better than a home-cooked goulash. I stand my ground with that. Again, we come to a part that may confuse you. Oatmeal. Oatmeal was a dish that could be served as a breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was extremely cheap to make since it only really required oats, water, or milk, and if possible, some toppings. Plus, it only took 5 minutes to prepare. It was an inexpensive, hearty staple of the 70s. Oatmeal was served to entire families to provide energy for the day. Although I don't know how they could do any kind of work after eating oatmeal, I would definitely pass out. But I guess if you added some nuts and fruits to the mix, this simple dish could become a lavish meal. I just remembered a little anecdote. The first time I was making oats, I thought, why not make them with milk instead of water? I always resented the fact that my mom made them without milk. And so I did. I added bananas, honey, almonds, and cinnamon. And got this, cherries. I mean, it was truly a great oatmeal. If you choose to make my oatmeal recipe, just bear in mind you'll be running to the bathroom before you even finish your plate. A true recipe for disaster. I guess cherries and milk don't match very well, but oh, they were delicious. Much better than others, and that was the $1 New England clam chowder bowl. Why the association with the state? That is because the place became known for having cheap yet amazing and honest chowder. There was no fancy stuff going on, no special sauce, no secret ingredient. It was just plain good old chowder done right and proper. For just under $1, you could have clams in a creamy chowder with potatoes and bacon mixed in. There was not much seasoning since the dish was flavorful enough on its own, and you got it in this very cozy-looking plain bowl alongside oyster crackers. Sometimes a diner or sea shack or two would even serve a bread bowl with it just for $1. You could get a Salisbury steak with gravy, meatloaf, or fried chicken, served with mashed potatoes and rice. You could choose between peas, broccoli, or other vegetables. It was all the convenience a foodie could ask for at a price that seemed as if it came right out of a dream. Stuff like shrimp remoulade had somewhat of a renaissance in the era, as it was suddenly one of the most commonly eaten meals. States like Louisiana would have poached shrimp that had a tangy remoulade sauce which used a wide range of spices. In the South and Gulf Coast as well, it started to become a staple in crawfish boils and many popular seafood joints over the regions. Frozen shrimp was also rising and making a name for itself, and so people found ways to do it at home as well. Considering how affordable it was, it's no wonder the dish became so well-loved and widespread. Falafel has not always been the healthy lunch option we know it as today. It was also a great meal you could get on the street for an unbeatable price. They always made them extra crispy too, and we all know how good street-side stalls are at deep frying. The herbs and spices were a lot stronger than the ones we are used to today, and tahini sauce was particularly popular. While it was initially only popular in neighborhoods with a Middle Eastern or Turkish community, it started gaining a big name for itself as a protein-heavy meal you could have almost anywhere, and it filled you up too. American palates in the 1970s in general started to take more of an interest in foreign cuisines, and the falafel sandwich was an example of it. If we take a bit of a stroll towards the fine dining side of things, we will find an array of Cornish game hens on silver platters being served up to the gentry and occasional family on a night out. It was also something that home chefs became somewhat infatuated with amidst all of the attention chicken was getting. For people that wanted to change it up, they absolutely adored the prospect of game hens. By the middle of the 1970s, they were in enough demand that most grocery outlets and meat establishments began to keep a steady supply of hens. The interest in them started mostly because of celebrity chefs and various cooking shows that featured delightful recipes involving Cornish game hens. Plus, it does not help matters when you consider that the 70s was a very creativity-oriented and experimentative phase of America's cultural history. A while back, when we were discussing falafels, we mentioned how they were a side effect of a growing national interest in the unknown delicacies that were past their own borders. You can only have so many quarter-pounders and meatloaves before your mind starts to wander. And there you have it. 2 hours of lunches only Grandma could make. Let us know which one's your favorite in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.